The alien slaver sneered at the puny human diplomat, not knowing the captive humans would make him eat his words like jagged shards of glass. Jeremy Boyd gazed up at the sprawling alien megalopolis through the window of his descending shuttle, each towering skyscraper a monument to the Trill's technological superiority. The weary human ambassador straightened his suite, preparing to negotiate the impossible. Earth's leaders had sent him to find peace, but the Trill had already announced their demands. Humanity would surrender 90% of their resources and submit to alien rule, or the entire species would be eradicated. Jeremy knew humanity wouldn't last a day if war broke out. Their weapons were pea shooters compared to the Trill's planet crackers. The shuttle touched down, and Jeremy disembarked onto the alien landing pad. Pollux, his Trill counterpart, waited by a sleek hovercraft, his reptilian face etched with contempt. "Pollux, a pleasure to finally meet you," Jeremy said, forcing a diplomatic smile. Pollux's lips curled. "I'm sure." His tone oozed disdain. "This way, Earthling." Jeremy climbed into the hovercraft, gritting his teeth at Pollux's snub. As the craft smoothly accelerated over the alien city, the human struggled to make small talk. Pollux rebuffed him with grunts and one-word answers. Jeremy was about to try a new tactic when the hovercraft lurched, hurling him against the side. Pollux swerved, barely dodging an explosion that rocked a nearby skyscraper. "Extremist attack," the Trill said calmly as smoke billowed. "They want to sabotage the summit, push for full war against you primitives." Jeremy's stomach turned to lead. Humanity's survival depended on him forging peace here. But now, violent radicals were trying to plunge the two species into a war Earth couldn't win. As the hovercraft touched down at the negotiation chambers and Pollux led the way inside, Jeremy took a deep breath. He was facing the greatest challenge of his life, with the future of humanity itself on the line. The negotiation chamber was a cavernous, imposing room, with towering walls of jet-black stone that seemed to swallow the meager light. In the center squatted a massive circular table that could have seated 24, but only a handful of Trill officials were present, each one staring down at Jeremy with undisguised contempt as he took his seat across from Pollux. "The Trill Imperium will accept nothing less than the complete and total surrender of Earth," the lead official declared, his voice booming in the chamber. "You will turn over all resources to us and submit to our rule. These terms are non-negotiable." Jeremy swallowed hard. He had to make them see reason. "Please, we mean you no harm. Humanity only seeks to coexist peacefully with the Trill. If you'll just give us a chance." "Silence!" Pollux slammed a fist on the table. "We have entertained your pathetic species mewling long enough. You are primitives, hardly worth the air you breathe." The other officials nodded in agreement, sneering at Jeremy like he was an insect. Desperation crept into Jeremy's voice. "I'm begging you, show mercy. We'll give you a share of our resources, we'll restrict our expansion, just don't destroy us." The Trill officials glanced at each other, then burst out laughing. The cruel sound echoed in the cavernous chamber. Jeremy looked desperately to Pollux, but his counterpart just smirked. As the laughter died down, Jeremy noticed the Trill officials almost seemed to be installing. They made no move to continue discussions or present a treaty. They just watched him, waiting. He opened his mouth to question their inaction. Suddenly the world exploded. The chamber rocked violently as a thunderous boom shattered the air. Jeremy was hurled from his chair, crashing to the floor in a rain of pulverized stone. His head swam, ears ringing. Smoke choked his lungs. Blinking away blood and dust, Jeremy staggered to his feet. His eyes widened in shock. A massive hole had been blasted clean through the chamber wall, the edges still glowing molten orange. Armored Trill soldiers surged through the breach, fanning out with weapons raised. Pollux and the officials were gone, vanished in the chaos. Jeremy spun around wildly, but there was no sign of them. As the truth sank in, his heart seized with dread. This had all been a ruse. Pollux had betrayed him, left him here to die, left humanity to burn. The soldiers advanced on Jeremy, a dozen rifle barrels pointed at his skull. He raised his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. Maybe, just maybe, he could talk his way out of this, convince them to take him prisoner, buy Earth a little more time. But as he met the merciless, cold-blooded eyes of the Trill troopers, Jeremy knew it was hopeless. They had no intention of letting him live. He wasn't a captive. He was a loose end to be tied off. He silently apologized to every human soul, all 12 billion, whose survival had rested on his shoulders. He had failed them. Now, their fate would be the same as his own. The lead Trill soldier smiled a razor smile and flicked the safety off his rifle. Jeremy's fingers fumbled for the spherical device crammed in his pocket, pulling it out and raising it high, as the Trill soldiers' barrels honed in on him. They paused, gazes flicking from his face to the metallic orb, trigger fingers twitching. Jeremy's thumb found the hidden button and pressed down hard, bracing for either a miracle or oblivion. A piercing screech knifed through the chamber, rising until it threatened to shatter Jeremy's eardrums. The Trill soldiers recoiled, hands clamping over the sides of their heads, faces screwed tight with agony. Jeremy lunged, his lean frame squeezing between the distracted troopers. He sprinted through the demolished negotiation room, vaulting chunks of rubble, the cries of the incapacitated soldiers fading behind him. He didn't slow as he reached the ragged hole blasted in the wall, throwing himself through into a narrow passageway lit only by flickering emergency strips. Jeremy tore down the corridor, blood roaring in his ears, expecting an energy bolt to slam into his back at any moment. His desperate flight brought him to a branching of the passageway. He skidded to a halt, chest heaving, head on a swivel, as he tried to get his bearings in the foreign labyrinth. The ominous clatter of pursuing footfalls decided his next move for him. The Trill troopers had shaken off the sonic blast and were closing fast. Jeremy plunged down the left-hand corridor, legs churning, the sweat of fear slicking his back. All he could do was pray this route led somewhere, anywhere, but a dead end and a hail of plasma fire. He careened around a bend in the passage and jerked to a stop, finding himself face to face with a knot of Trill civilians. They cowered against the walls, staring at him in unalloyed terror, clearly fearing he was the vanguard of some awful fate. Jeremy slowly raised his hands, palms out. "I mean you no harm," he said as calmly as he could manage, with his pulse still thundering in his throat. "I'm here to help." The Trills shifted and muttered, a few shooting disbelieving looks at their fellows. A younger male hesitantly stepped clear of the press, his eyes flickering over Jeremy's dirt-stained features. "We know who you are," he said, voice quavering but steadying as he continued. "You're the human diplomat. We saw the negotiations on the news feeds." Jeremy dipped his chin, relief surging through him at the prospect of finding allies in this nightmare. "The negotiations were a trap," he said, low and urgent. "The Trill military is moving to crush the peace. We have to get out of here and warn Earth before it's too late." The young Trill's eyes hardened and he set his jaw. "Follow me," he said with a sharp gesture. "I can guide us out of the city." Jeremy nodded sharply at Zephyr, and the Trill civilians fell in behind the young male as he led them into the warren of alleys snaking through the alien city. They scurried from shadow to shadow, pressing tight to walls when the tramp of military boots echoed from adjacent streets. Zephyr held up a hand, halting the group at the mouth of a trash-strewn alley as a Trill patrol clanked past, their armor glinting under the sickly yellow street lamps. When the soldiers disappeared from view, Zephyr waved the group forward. They ducked down the alley, the Trill civilians glancing about nervously, flinching at every distant shout or whine of a hover engine. Jeremy gripped the metallic orb in his pocket, the sonic device his only weapon against the might of the Trill military. At last they reached a sagging, decrepit warehouse squatting at the edge of the city. Zephyr shouldered open a rusted side door, the metal shrieking in protest. Jeremy and the others filed inside the cavernous space, picking their way between haphazard stacks of mouldering crates and tangles of abandoned machinery. The sour reek of decay clogged the air. Zephyr dropped to his knees near the center of the warehouse floor. His fingers scrabbled at a recessed handle, then heaved upward. An entire section of the grimy floor swung up on hidden hinges, revealing a dark passage below. A faint, eerie glow emanated from the tunnel's depths. "Quickly down here," Zephyr urged, already descending a narrow ladder bolted to the tunnel wall. Jeremy ushered the frightened Trill civilians to the ladder, making sure they were all accounted for before following Zephyr into the gloom. As he climbed down, the trapdoor swung shut above him, plunging the tunnel into darkness relieved only by the glow ahead. His boots touched down on dampstone. Zephyr was waiting at the end of a short passage. As Jeremy approached, he saw the source of the glow, patches of luminous fungi dotting the walls of a large, domed chamber. In the center of the chamber squatted a sleek black shape that made Jeremy's breath catch. What is that?" he asked, moving forward as if in a dream. "That is our way out," Zephyr said. "A stealth ship fresh from the workshops of rebel Trill scientists. With this we can slip past the blockade and reach Earth undetected." Jeremy circled the spacecraft, his fingertips brushing over the seamless hull. The craft was all clean lines and graceful curves, like a crouching panther wrought in metal. He wanted to believe in it, in Zephyr, in the possibility of hope. But after Pollux's betrayal, trust was a tall order. He turned to Zephyr, his jaw tight. "Why should I believe you? How do I know this isn't another trap?" Zephyr met Jeremy's gaze unflinchingly. "You don't, but right now I'm the only chance you've got." Jeremy held Zephyr's eyes a moment longer, then nodded. He knew the Trill rebel was right. Trying to fight his way out of the city would be suicide. The ship was a risk, but it was the only play he had left. Jeremy moved to the ship's hatch, Zephyr close behind, the Trill civilians clustered nearby, their eyes wide with fear and hope. He reached for the hatch controls. Suddenly, shouts and pounding feet echoed from the tunnel behind them. Jeremy spun. Half a dozen Trill soldiers charged into the chamber, plasma rifles held at the ready. Zephyr grabbed Jeremy's arm. "Run!" They sprinted for the hatch, plasma bolts sizzling past them to gouge smoking craters in the stone. Jeremy's hand slapped the hatch controls, and it slid open with a hydraulic hiss. A bolt clipped his shoulder, and he cried out, staggering. Zephyr heaved Jeremy through the hatch, the searing pain in his shoulder obliterating all other sensation. He was distantly aware of Zephyr dragging him to the side, of the hatch slamming shut on the furious shouts of the soldiers, of the hull shuddering as plasma fire spattered harmlessly off the armored hull. Jeremy slumped against the bulkhead, his hand clamped over the scorched ruin of his shoulder. He dimly registered Zephyr's blurry shape dropping into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the controls. The ship lurched as the engines roared to life. The inertial dampeners struggled to compensate as the craft hurtled upwards, the bone-shaking vibrations rattling Jeremy's teeth. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw before slipping into oblivion was the curve of the planet receding through the forward viewports as the ship knifed into the starry abyss of space. Jeremy lurched upright, his head pounding in time with the shrieking alarms. He clamped a hand to his shoulder, hissing through gritted teeth at the searing pain. Blinking away the fog of unconsciousness, he stumbled to the cockpit. Zephyr hunched over the controls, his knuckles white, his face a mask of intense focus. "What's happening?" Jeremy croaked. "We're being pursued," Zephyr bit out. "A Trill warship has locked onto our position and is closing fast." Ice poured through Jeremy's veins. This stealth ship was a marvel of engineering, but against a fully armed dreadnought it might as well be made of paper. The ship convulsed, throwing Jeremy against the bulkhead. Plasma bolts hammered the shields, the impacts reverberating through the hull. Warning lights burst across the control panel like a plague of hellish fireflies. "Shields are failing," Zephyr roared over the cacophony. "We need to find a place to hide, and fast." Jeremy staggered to the navigation console, his eyes raking the star chart. There, a dense field of asteroids, a scant few light-years distant. "We can use the asteroids for cover," he said, stabbing a finger at the screen. Zephyr nodded sharply. His fingers flew over the controls, plotting their course. The ship leaped forward, racing for the dubious safety of the asteroids. The field filled the viewports, a churning sea of jagged rock and spinning mountains. The ship bucked and heaved as it plunged into the maelstrom, the inertial dampeners straining to compensate. Zephyr wove through the deadly labyrinth, the hull screaming as he threaded gaps barely wider than the ship itself. Behind them, the warship dogged their trail, its weapons lashing out with merciless precision. Plasma charges detonated against asteroids, spraying molten shrapnel across the ship's failing shields. Jeremy gripped the console, his eyes scouring the field. There had to be somewhere to hide, somewhere to... There. A fissure yawned in the flank of a monstrous asteroid, a shadowed cave just large enough to shelter them. "There!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "We can hide in that cave." Zephyr wrenched the controls. The ship slewed sickeningly, diving for the crevice. The hull howled as it scraped through the opening, a hair's breadth from utter destruction. They slid into the sheltering dark of the cave. Zephyr killed the engines, then punched a command into the console. The cloaking field shimmered to life around the ship, wrapping them in blessed invisibility. Scant seconds later, the warship thundered past the cave mouth. It hovered there for a moment, scanning, seeking. But the tons of rock and metal shrouding them foiled its sensors. With a blast of its thrusters, it moved off, the hunters thwarted of their prey. For now. Jeremy and Zephyr slumped back in their seats, chests heaving, the sudden silence ringing in their ears. They exchanged a look of raw relief, hardly daring to believe they had escaped. And then the asteroid shuddered around them. A deep, grating rumble vibrated through the cave, the sound of a world tearing itself apart. Zephyr's eyes flew wide with sudden realization and stark fear. "That's not good," he breathed. "I think this asteroid is unstable. We need to get out of here now." Zephyr's hands flew over the controls as the engines roared to life. The ship shuddered, straining against the inexorable pull of the collapsing asteroid. Fissures raced along the walls of the cave, widening into yawning chasms. Massive chunks of rock broke free from the ceiling, plummeting down in a deadly hail. Jeremy gripped the armrests of his seat, knuckles white, as Zephyr wove the ship through the falling debris. The Trill rebel's face was a mask of intense focus, his eyes darting between the viewports and the sensor readouts. A jagged boulder the size of a shuttle slammed into the ship's left engine. The impact reverberated through the hull, the deck bucking beneath their feet. Alarms shrieked as the engine sputtered and died, trailing smoke and sparks. The ship lurched drunkenly, throwing Jeremy from his seat. He slammed into the bulkhead with bone-jarring force, pain exploding through his skull. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision. Zephyr wrestled with the controls, trying to keep the ship level as it careened out of the disintegrating cave. The remaining engine whined in protest, pushed far beyond its limits. They burst from the asteroid into open space, the black void spattered with stars. For a heartbeat, Jeremy dared to hope they had escaped. Then he saw the Trill warship, looming before them like a monstrous predator. Its weapons were charged and locked on, the gaping maws of its missile tubes yawning wide. Jeremy and Zephyr locked eyes, raw despair passing between them. Against this Leviathan they had no chance. Earth had no chance. The warship's flank erupted in a massive explosion, a miniature supernova that hurled the Trill vessel into a wild spin. More blasts followed, stitching across the dreadnought's hull in fiery lines. Slicing out from behind the asteroid field came a swarm of human ships, all sleek lines and bristling weapon arrays. They moved like quicksilver, lancing through space, their plasma cannons and fusion missiles hammering the Trill ship with relentless precision. The warship reeled under the onslaught, its shields flaring and failing. Gouts of flame jetted from rents in its armor as atmosphere vented into the void. "This is Captain Alexei Volkov of the Earth Defense Fleet," a clipped voice crackled over the comm. "We have you covered, Ambassador Boyd. Proceed to the rendezvous point immediately." Jeremy sagged back in his seat, relief crashing over him in a tidal wave. Beside him, Zephyr let out a shaky laugh, his fingers flying over the controls as he laid in a course for the rendezvous. The stealth ship limped away from the titanic space battle, its sole remaining engine pushed to the breaking point. But even as they fled, Jeremy couldn't tear his eyes from the human fleet. Pride surged through him at the sight of those brave ships, the indomitable spirit of humanity made manifest in metal and fire. Perhaps Earth was not as outmatched as the Trill believed. Perhaps there was still hope. Yet even as they made their escape, a cold tendril of dread curled in Jeremy's gut. This was only the opening salvo in a war that would shake the very stars. The Trill would not soon forget this humiliation. They would return with all the might and fury of a wounded predator. And when they did, humanity would need every scrap of courage and cunning to weather the coming firestorm. The fight for Earth's survival had only just begun. Jeremy gaped at the titanic vessel looming before them, its armored hull bristling with turrets. The Earth battleship dwarfed any Trill ship he'd seen, a colossus of human military might. Zephyr guided their battered craft into the destroyer's cavernous hangar, the refugee ship shuddering as it settled on the deck with a metallic clang. The hatch opened with a hiss, and Jeremy stepped out into a throng of grim-faced soldiers, Zephyr at his side. A tall, broad-shouldered man, with a neatly trimmed beard, strode towards them, his piercing blue eyes fixing Jeremy with an intense stare. Captain Volkov clasped Jeremy's hand in a firm shake. "Ambassador Boyd, good to see you in one piece. We have much to discuss." Jeremy nodded, his mouth dry. He followed Volkov into the battleship's sleek corridors, Zephyr keeping pace. The winding halls bustled with activity, crew and soldiers moving with purpose. Cutting-edge human tech gleamed on every bulkhead, quantum computers, advanced power systems, railguns that could punch through an asteroid. But for all the ship's technological marvels, a palpable tension suffused the air. Soldiers gripped plasma rifles with white knuckles, their eyes hard and watchful. Crew hurried by with tight expressions, jaws clenched. The entire vessel practically hummed with nervous energy, like a coiled spring ready to explode. Volkov led them into a large circular chamber, dominated by an immense holographic star map. The Trill Empire glowed an angry scarlet, splashed across a vast swath of the galaxy. Volkov gestured at the blood-red regions, his face grim. The Trill have conquered dozens of worlds, enslaved entire species, stripped planets of resources, and Earth is next on their list. They won't stop until they grind us under their heel. An icy claw of fear squeezed Jeremy's heart as he stared at the hologram, the sheer scope of the threat hitting him like a gut punch. The Trill weren't just a hostile power. They were an existential threat to humanity itself. Suddenly the room plunged into darkness, the hologram winking out. Alarms shrieked, the sound stabbing into Jeremy's ears. The deck shuddered underfoot, the unmistakable impact of weapons fire slamming into the hull. "We're under attack," Volkov roared, yanking his sidearm from its holster. "All hands to battle stations." Jeremy locked eyes with Zephyr, raw terror surging through him. The Trill had found them. The battle for the very survival of the human race had begun. Jeremy and Zephyr sprinted onto the bridge, the deck shuddering under their boots, as the human battleship traded blows with its Trill counterpart. The view screen filled the forward bulkhead, displaying the titanic space battle in all its terrible glory. Crew members hunched over consoles, hands flying over touchscreens slick with sweat. Their shouts formed a clipped staccato, relaying shield strength and weapon status with terse efficiency. Volkov stood at the eye of the storm, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes riveted to the view screen. The Trill warship loomed before them, an angular behemoth bristling with gun batteries. Its hull shimmered with the telltale distortion of full-strength shields. "Concentrate fire on their forward shield generators," Volkov ordered, his voice cutting through the clamor. "Reroute auxiliary power to the plasma cannons." The human fleet swarmed the Trill ship, their smaller vessels buzzing around it like wasps attacking a bear. They swooped and dove, peppering the warship with laser fire and fusion missiles. The Trill ship shuddered but held firm. Its main cannon swiveled, locking onto a human frigate. A coruscating beam of pure energy sliced across the void, skewering the frigate through its midsection. The smaller ship crumpled like tin foil, secondary explosions rippling through its hull. Jeremy flinched as the frigate disintegrated, the deaths of hundreds of souls searing into his retinas. Bile seared his throat, but he choked it down, his fingernails digging bloody crescents into his palms. "Target those turrets, damn it," Volkov roared. "Don't let them get another shot off." The human ships regrouped, focusing their fire on the Trill cannons. Missiles and laser blasts hammered the warship, its shields flaring with each impact. The barrage reached a crescendo, and the Trill's defenses finally buckled, energy washing back and forth across the hull as the generators overloaded. "Shields are down," a sensor officer called out, her voice taut. "We've got a window." "All ships fire at will," Volkov commanded, his face a mask of fierce concentration. "Gut the bastards." The human fleet opened up as one, a blistering torrent of plasma and high-yield explosives. The Trill ship staggered under the onslaught, explosions marching across its hull. One of its engines flared and went dark, the vessel listing drunkenly. A ragged cheer went up from the bridge crew. Jeremy dared to hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could. "New contact," the sensor officer shouted, her voice laced with dread. "Another Trill warship inbound fast." Jeremy's stomach turned to ice as a second ship materialized on the view screen. It made its wounded compatriot look like a tugboat, a juggernaut of angular armor and jutting gun emplacements. Its forward batteries thrummed with gathering power as it bore down on the beleaguered human fleet. Volkov's jaw clenched, the muscles working under his skin. He turned to his crew, his eyes hard as flint. "Prepare to engage the second vessel," he said, his voice steady despite the impossible odds. "We'll hit them with everything we've got." The bridge exploded into activity, the crew scrambling to obey. Zephyr grabbed Jeremy's arm, his grip painful. "We're not going to make it, are we?" he whispered, his voice small and terrified in the controlled chaos. Jeremy met his friend's eyes, his mouth dry. He wanted to reassure Zephyr, to promise him they'd find a way. But as he looked out at the monstrous Trill ships, their hulls bristling with enough firepower to reduce the human fleet to molten slag, the words turned to ashes on his tongue. They were outmatched and outgunned in every way. All they could do was fight to the last, and pray for a miracle that Jeremy knew in his bones would never come. Jeremy stared up at the gargantuan Trill dreadnought looming on the view screen. The merciless Leviathan spewed tongues of plasma into the void, hammering the battered human fleet. It was the apocalypse made manifest, come to devour their last hope. Volkov stood firm before the storm, undaunted. His eyes locked on the monstrosity rampaging across the starscape, his jaw clenched with purpose. With a voice of unwavering steel, he gave the order. "Set course directly for that warship, full speed ahead." Stunned silence smothered the bridge. Crew gaped at their captain in disbelief. This was suicide, but Volkov held firm, unmoved, unyielding. "Do it!" Swallowing their fear, the crew obeyed. The human battleship accelerated on a terminal trajectory, aimed like a spear at the heart of the beast. The behemoth swelled in the view screen, blotting out the stars, filling existence with its armored hide. At point-blank range on the cusp of oblivion itself, Volkov's arm slashed down. "Fire everything!" The human battleship vomited destruction. A maelstrom of missiles, searing beams, and sun-bright plasma erupted from every weapon emplacement. The fusillade converged on a single point, a chink in the monster's carapace. The Trill warship's shields crumpled under the deluge. Explosions marched across its hull in rippling chains. Armor buckled, split, vaporized. And still it came on, inexorable, implacable. Gaping wounds in its flank seethed with building energy, preparing a final, cataclysmic retort. Then a new sun bloomed. The battleship's onslaught found a critical flaw. The Trill Leviathan staggered, shuddered, reeled. Secondary explosions ripped through its innards. Its engines coughed, sputtered, died. The crippled hulk spun out of control, belching flame and shattered metal. With a final convulsive detonation, it disintegrated. A ragged cheer went up from the human bridge crew, cries of joy and relief. But the victory was bitter ashes on the tongue. The first warship, savaged but unbroken, swung back to face them, its weapons pulsing with murderous intent. Volkov turned to Jeremy, the weight of worlds in his eyes. "Ambassador, I need you to do something for me." Jeremy swallowed hard, pulse pounding. "Anything, Captain?" "Take a message to Earth. Tell them what transpired here. That we fought to the last, that the Trill are coming, that they must prepare." Anguish clenched Jeremy's heart, but he nodded. "I will, I swear it." A sad smile flickered across Volkov's face. "Go, take Zephyr. Get to the escape pods. We'll hold them as long as we can." Every instinct screamed at Jeremy to stay, to stand and fight and die with these heroes. But Volkov was right. Earth had to be warned. Hating himself, Jeremy turned and fled, Zephyr at his heels, the sounds of renewed battle chasing them through the corridors. All he could do was run and pray they would reach Earth before the onrushing dark. Jeremy and Zephyr sprinted through the shuddering battleship, sparks erupting from shattered conduits, the deck pitching beneath their boots. Trill weapons fire hammered the hull, the impacts reverberating through the dying vessel. They skidded around a corner and saw the escape pod bay ahead. Zephyr slapped the control panel and a pod hissed open. They dove inside, hands shaking as they fumbled with the restraints. Jeremy cast one final glance through the pod's viewport at the ravaged battleship interior. The brave men and women of the Earth Defense Fleet had given everything to buy them this one desperate chance. Volkov's grim face flashed through Jeremy's mind, and sorrow clenched his heart. Zephyr punched the launch button. The pod sealed with a hiss and shot free of the ship. As it blasted away, the battleship erupted in a blinding flash. The reactor core detonated in a sun-bright explosion, consuming the once mighty vessel in a maelstrom of plasma and debris. Jeremy squeezed his eyes shut, hot tears spilling down his cheeks. Those heroes had sacrificed it all so that humanity might have a future. He silently vowed not to let their deaths be in vain. The escape pod tore through the void, Earth's blue-green orbs swelling to fill the viewports. But as they approached, a cold dread gripped Jeremy's gut. A massive Trill armada encircled the planet, their ships glinting in the sun like a shoal of ravenous sharks. The pod shook as it wove through the fleet, plasma bolts sizzling past the viewport. They hit the atmosphere hard, the pod bucking and yawing. The heat shield glowed cherry red as they screamed through the air. With a bone-jarring thud, the pod slammed into a barren expanse of desert hardpan. Jeremy and Zephyr kicked the hatch open and staggered out, their battered bodies screaming with every movement. Smoke stained the sky and the stench of burning filled their nostrils. Lifting their eyes, they saw the Trill ships descending on the population centers like a plague of locusts. In the distance, the sounds of battle rang out, the crack of energy weapons, the roar of explosions, the screams of the dying. The awful truth crashed over Jeremy, and he sank to his knees in the dust. They had given everything, fought with the last full measure of courage and devotion, and it still hadn't been enough. Earth was lost. Humanity was lost. Zephyr gripped Jeremy's shoulder, his voice thick with grief. "We can't give up. We have to keep fighting no matter the cost, for Earth, for the memory of all those who died to give us this chance." Jeremy met his friend's eyes and saw the same anguish, the same grim resolve. He climbed to his feet, jaw clenched. Zephyr was right. They couldn't let it all be for nothing. As the Trill ships rained devastation on the cities, the two survivors turned their backs on the carnage. With heavy hearts and the unquenchable fire of human defiance, they strode into the wilderness. The fight had only just begun. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.